In the dead silence of a market waiting for clarity, a file lands on a desk inside Washington, a file so heavy it feels like it carries the weight of an entire digital future, and in that moment, everything begins to shift, because behind closed doors, far away from the noise of Twitter traders and late-night YouTube predictions, something final is being written, something that could end the story that has dragged on for years. And every XRP holder watching this needs to understand exactly what is happening now, because the clock is running out and the stakes have never been higher. From the moment the SEC first stepped into the ring with Ripple, a shadow was cast across the entire crypto market, fear spread, exchanges delisted, and uncertainty began to choke innovation. And yet, Ripple refused to fold, refusing to give the government an easy win, refusing to let XRP be labeled something it was never meant to be, and that resistance became the foundation of the final playbook unfolding right now. Inside Ripple headquarters, attorneys move like soldiers preparing for a final battle, documents stacked in towering piles, legal strategies drawn like battlefield maps. Every argument sharpened to a blade, every detail positioned to strike at the heart of the SEC's narrative, and deep within those documents is a strategy that the agency never wanted the public to see, a strategy designed not just to defend XRP, but to expose the flaws of the case that has lingered for far too long. Meanwhile, inside the SEC, tension grows, deadlines approach, internal pressure mounts, conflicting opinions collide behind closed doors, and regulators realize that every step they take is being watched by lawmakers, investors, banks, and nations preparing for digital currency expansion, because the Ripple case is no longer just a lawsuit, it has become a symbol, a warning, a crossroads between government control and financial innovation. And now, with the final phase approaching, Ripple's attorneys make their move, laying out a timeline of every contradiction, every misstep, every inconsistency the SEC presented, turning the agency's own words into weapons, and suddenly, the momentum shifts, the air changes, and the case that once seemed endless begins to crack under its own weight. Investors feel it. Institutions feel it, even the market feels it, the tension rising like a wave pulling back before the crash, because everyone knows that when a case this big reaches its breaking point, the impact on the digital future will be felt around the world, and that is why you need to watch every second of this video, because the next steps will determine not just XRP's fate, but the fate of the entire crypto ecosystem. Regulation is coming, clarity is coming, timelines are collapsing into a narrow corridor where one final decision must be made, and behind the scenes, both sides prepare for the last chapter, Ripple sharpening its evidence, the SEC re-evaluating its position, lawmakers circling, financial giants waiting to move billions once the fog clears, and every viewer here needs to understand exactly how this ends, because in the final playbook, there is a moment where everything changes, a moment where the SEC must either concede ground or risk a precedent that could limit its power forever. A moment where Ripple's vision for global liquidity can finally step into the light without legal chains holding it down, and that moment is close, closer than most people realize, closer than the market is prepared for, and when the final ruling drops, when the last barrier falls, the story will not end, it will only begin, because what comes next for XRP is bigger than price charts, bigger than short-term speculation, bigger than any rumor. What comes next is adoption, integration, global corridors opening, liquidity flowing through rails that were built long before the lawsuit even began. And those who understand the timing will be the ones positioned for everything that follows, so stay with me until the very end, because you are about to see the complete outline of the final Ripple vs. SEC playbook, the strategy that ends the longest legal war in crypto, and the roadmap for what comes after the dust settles, because once clarity arrives, once regulation is locked in, once institutions finally have the legal green light they spent years waiting for, XRP will step into a role that has been waiting for it since day one, a role that could rewrite the future of global payments. And that future starts now. When the ruling finally hits, the first shock will not come from the court itself, but from the markets, from the institutions that have been waiting in silence, from the banks that paused their plans until legal clarity arrived, and the moment the decision becomes official, a spark moves through the entire financial system, a quiet confirmation that the uncertainty holding everything back has finally snapped. Exchanges begin to move, one by one, preparing relisting notices behind the scenes, liquidity desks activate dormant XRP pairs, and order books that have been empty for years suddenly start to breathe again. Because the ruling does more than settle a lawsuit, it removes the fear that kept major platforms frozen in place, and the return of XRP liquidity is only the first domino. Inside global banks, blueprints are pulled from drawers, plans paused since 2020 are reviewed again, teams huddle around digital payment maps, corridors from Asia to Europe to the Middle East are re-examined, because with regulatory clarity secured, nothing stops the activation of ODL expansion. Nothing stops institutions from moving forward with the technology they were forced to wait on, and every step they take sends waves through the crypto world. Meanwhile, central banks take notice, policy groups whisper behind closed doors, the timeline for CBDC integration accelerates, and Ripple's partnerships with monetary authorities begin to surface in a new light, stronger than before, clearer than ever. Because the lawsuit was the only shadow blocking global adoption, and with that shadow lifted, the XRPL steps into a new phase of legitimacy never seen before. Investors feel the shift instantly, long-term holders who survived the storm watch as liquidity floods back into the system, new investors enter, old investors return, and the narrative around XRP transforms from uncertainty to inevitability, because a legally defined digital asset backed by real-world use cases becomes something more than speculation, it becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure is what institutions trust, but the biggest change comes from the regulatory world itself. Lawmakers realized that the Ripple case exposed gaps in the system, exposed contradictions, exposed the need for updated digital asset frameworks, and those frameworks begin to form, slowly at first, then rapidly, each new policy reinforcing what XRP now represents, an asset with clarity, with purpose, with a defined role in global finance. Ripple moves quickly too, accelerating partnerships, signing new corridors, revealing projects that were years in development but stalled by legal uncertainty, and one by one these announcements reshaped the entire narrative, showing the world that the company was not just fighting a case, it was preparing for the moment after the case, preparing to step into a global arena with no restrictions, and the market begins to understand, this was never just a legal battle, it was a gateway moment. The turning of a page that leads to mass adoption, enterprise integration, cross-border liquidity, payment rail expansion, and a wave of utility that stretches far beyond price action, because the real value of XRP was never in hype, it was in the architecture built around it, architecture that now has a green light to activate worldwide. Then comes the institutional wave, the hedge funds, the payment providers, the remittance giants, the fintech platforms, each one moving quietly but decisively, building positions, securing infrastructure, preparing for the long game, because clarity turns speculation into strategy, and strategy is what drives capital on a level retail has never seen. And finally, the global narrative shifts. The media begins to cover XRP not as a lawsuit story, but as a financial technology story. Banks talk about integration, governments talk about digital transformation, institutions talk about liquidity, efficiency, and the world begins to see what Ripple saw from the beginning. That XRP was always designed to fill a gap in the global economy. A gap that no other asset can fill the same way, and as all of this unfolds, the holders who understood the timeline, the ones who stayed through years of silence and conflict, begin to see the future forming in front of them, a future where XRP moves not as a speculative token, but as the backbone of a new digital liquidity system, and that future begins the moment clarity arrives, the moment the ruling drops, the moment the world realizes the fight is over and the building begins.